Jason,
Thank you for what?
that groan.
Oh, yeah, my back is still.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, my back is still kind of screwed.
Have you gone to the doctor?
No, I need to probably have some. This is wisdom of Solomon. No, I need to go to the doctor, but it doesn't hurt as it did as bad as before, so I just press on. All right. I know. I need to go. I need to have some PT, get my back in shape. Let's start the wisdom of Solomon rather than make me feel bad about my lack of health care for my life. The wisdom of Solomon sounds like it should be like, why did they take it out? Like, is this another, Song of Solomon? The Song of Solomon was a little racy, but that's not. It's more so about the wisdom, or Proverbs would be comparable to it. Just a reminder, there are many wisdom books in the Old Testament: Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, Proverbs, and dropping one. But wisdom of Solomon, for some, are considered a part of these writings. They are not considered to be a part of the Jewish canon. They're recognized by the Roman Catholic Church wholeheartedly, and are attached as a part of their Old Testament. Or actually, their what is it? Their Old Testament, or their? Where did I write that down? No, it's a part of their Old Testament, and then we as Protestants put it in our Apocrypha. It's also called the Book of Wisdom. Its authorship has gone through some turbulent times of trying to figure out, was it one author or not turbulent, it's gone back and forth. There's an argument over whether it was one author and then he was an Alexandrian Jew living in Egypt, which just meant he was a sort of Jew in diaspora living in Egypt, but who was Hellenized enough to write and to be educated in Greek. But it's either they assume that if it's multiple authors, and there's reasons for the multiple authors, as you look at the book, it could be either divided up into 3 book sections or into 2 sections, and we'll talk about those obviously in a little bit. But it was originally written in Greek, and when they date it to 100 to 50 BC. So think Christ coming on the scene about a century before Christ, sometime in the century before Christ, this was written in Greek, And the reason the reason they think that was because of both the language and the textual considerations around how it was written. And they compare that with other documents that were written in a similar time, as we'll find out later. It has similarities to the Book of Jubilee, Philo, Life of Moses, Second Enoch, and the Ascension of Isaiah, all that were written in a similar. So when you have languages that sort of borrow common phraseology, they put it in a certain period, but they do suggest that by at least it would have been written before 70 AD when the destruction of the temple. So theoretically, this could have been written even during the time of Christ. There's a lot of debate. Most people, I would say, most scholars say one author, written about 50 BC, and the setting was a Jewish community in Egypt. The sources for it, because it was written in Greek, it's thought that he borrowed from they took sources from the Septuagint. They use the Septuagint. Again, the Septuagint is the Hebrew Bible written in Greek. But it also has direct connections to, in terms of source material, to all of the wisdom literature that is in the Old Testament. Isaiah, the Book of Enoch, which again is another apocryphal book, and a heavy dose just in language and phraseology of Greek philosophy. So basically, what you have is when you take this genre of Hebrew wisdom literature, and if you were to reinterpret that through a Hellenized Greek culture, you're going to get the wisdom of Solomon. Now, Solomon, if it was actually Solomon, he wouldn't have written this way. There's too much dissonance between the original. I mean, when you look at the original Proverbs, it's written very much in a Hebraic, not just verse and line style, but just in language and in reference as well. The audience, although in both chapters 1 and in 6, bless you, which mark the two breaks. There, if you were to go for the threefold, it would go chapter 1, chapter 6, and chapter 10. You can start hacking for me. It's not gonna, you don't hold it in. That's the worst, and your eyes start watering, and then it hurts even worse. Just hack it out. I'll edit it out.
Turn
of
on the spotlight.
I know. Well, I was trying to free you, yeah. But the rulers of the earth are what's listed in chapter 1 in the beginning, and we'll look at that in chapter 6. And so it's written to the rulers of the earth, with the extent of saying, this is what it means to be wise, and this is what it means to be foolish. It is thought, though, by later scholars that it was more likely written to a local Jewish community who were being influenced by Hellenization and the Greek culture and an Egyptian context. It was basically just sort of like, you know what? It doesn't really matter. I mean, this is again in that 400 years of silence. So 300 years into it, you still don't have any message from God. At that point, Jews generally thought that God had abandoned them. Although, it would have been a referential point to go back to the 400 years of slavery, but it was just a sense of where is God in all of this? We don't have any prophets. We don't, and this again, that's what makes John the Baptist such a pivotal figure, is because he was the first prophet that came out. During the end of that period. The style I said was in Hebrew verse. It is written in the middle section, in particular in chapter 6 to 9, in first person, as if it was actually King Solomon writing, which is what gave folks in the first few centuries of the church who were Jewish, they would have attached itself. If you see a document that says, that it claims some sort of ownership or authorship to a figure, you would have paid more attention. So the practice, as we learned before, was called pseudepigrapha, which is just basically someone posing as another person in order to draw their audience, not in a, like, I'm pretending to be that person, more so because they feel like they're writing in the tradition of that person. So because these are wisdom literatures, they basically were writing in the sense of Hebrew verse with sort of a modernization of it. But when they claim King Solomon as the author, it's meant to say, hey, this is connected. This is the same. And in many ways it is. I mean, if you look at wisdom literature, or if you look at the Hebrew literature as a whole, it's obey God and get blessings, disobey God and get curses. And this is sort of the same thing, but the obedience is the result of wisdom as opposed to just flat out obey. Because the canonicity, I told you about that. It's also considered not just in terms of its writing. Someone called there's a play between a mosaic in the sense of Moses or that law or the prophet in that sense of the Hebrew culture, and Platonic thought. So again, it's that merging of Hebrew and Greek culture, someone called it an enconion. I don't know the word enconion, which means a hymn of a praise. And so what they're doing is they're taking the Hebrew tradition of praising wisdom, but they appeal to reason in a very unique way, which is that Hellenization, that Greek influence. So there's now all of a sudden wisdom is not necessarily anti-reason, but wisdom stands on its own. And then reason and logic, are also sort of stand on their own. And there's a major overlap between them two in terms of what we call sapiential theology or wisdom theology. But rationality doesn't always necessarily, sometimes wisdom has this other facet of love to it. Logic is just logic. You can have love and logic, but I think there's a parenting book called that now I'm thinking about it. But wisdom is based out of a love for in the Hebrew context, a love for righteousness. And so the focus of reason, so what you have is you have this wisdom, love of righteousness literature combined with the logic and rationality of the Hellenized Greek culture. Herman Melville actually was very impressed with it, and I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the extent of the combination. He saw the interplay between Platonic philosophy or Greek philosophy and Hebrew wisdom literature to be fascinating way to write. And we read Moby Dick, or theoretically read Moby Dick in high school, but I haven't read it since then. Moby Dick and Clarel, I guess, were two Herman Melville books, novels that were influenced by this interplay between sort of religious theology of the Hebrew wisdom literature and Greek philosophy. And he notes that about this wisdom. And so this interplay between those two influenced his writing of Moby Dick, which I found that's kind of interesting. I have to go back and look at the movie. What's that?
I never knew that.
No, neither did I. I would have to go back and look at that, but there are direct quotes from him that in terms of that. And also the other, just in terms of cultural usage, John Brown, the abolitionist, we talked about him in the Battle Hymn of the Republic, how the tune was set to John Brown's body. Apparently at his memorial service on the day of his execution, it was 1868 or 1886, I don't remember which one, but they read the second chapter, starting with more of the wisdom, Solomon, the middle section, which is sort of geared around the authorship of Solomon and sort of wisdom verse and verse. So I'm not exactly sure why or the rationale. I didn't dig deeply into that, but I thought, hey, that's an interesting usage in history. It has caused not a ton of debate, although it has in terms of, when you look just by sheer fact that it's thought that the earliest manuscript was Greek and not actually dating back to 800 before Christ, during the time of Solomonish, that it has sort of lost its canonicity. But just some church historians, Origen from the 2nd century, and as I was writing some of these down, I thought, I always hated when people, like I say these names not to, they may not be orienting markers for everyone in terms of where they are in history. And it actually, that led me to think that we should actually do a jaunt through church history and sort of, maybe this summer we'll look at some of that. But because it's helpful. So I say these names because it's good to orient them with certain centuries. So Origen, one of our earliest church fathers, was very uncertain about it. The Greek manuscripts are the first indication, and the fact that when you look at the Hebrew manuscripts, when there's a difference between them, then you're like, hey, well, maybe this shouldn't be there. Athanasius in the 3rd century, one of our church fathers, said it wasn't canon, but it was good to read. It wasn't something that we should hold as being, and I don't necessarily know if there's anything majorly problematic other than some discrepancies. We'll talk about those in it shortly, but it's still good to read. In other words, it's the wisdom literature that's being presented, and the message is being presented is problematic, but it just doesn't.
Let's tell the Bible studies then. He can wait. I'm sorry, I'm talking.
No, you're good. I just didn't know if you were talking to me. Augustine in the 4th century included it as a part of the Old Testament, and it continued through the 4th and 5th century. There was debate about whether or not it should be included. In the end, and I mentioned these 4, there was the Council of Rome, Hippo, Carthage, Florence, and Trent, ranging from dates from 382 up to 1564. So 1,200 years of history. It has been considered in the Western Church and the Roman Church, which is eventually the Roman Catholic Church, as a part of the Bible. So in Jim's Bible, it should be there just as part of the Bible. Is that right, Jim? Is that what kind of Bible is that, Jim? Is that a Roman Catholic, or it looks like a Jerusalem Bible to me?
It is a Roman Catholic.
New American.
New American.
As long as it's not King James, I'm okay.
What is this edition?
Okay, so the form it presents 2 sort of main aspects as we read in it. One is wisdom for humanity. It hinges on the idea that the perfection of knowledge, that we ought to focus on understanding and knowledge, because knowledge is God's gift through our wise actions. And I'm going to come back and explain this a little bit more. Where did I write it down? The reverse of that is unrighteousness. So when we're unrighteous, when we're wicked, when we sin, when we disobey God, in particular, think of that in terms of Jewish context, then that leads us to, the more you sin, the more you're unrighteous, the more you dwell in that space, it leads to senseless reasoning. In other words, our understanding of the world, how we make decisions, if we're in a state of unrighteousness, then our reason is impaired. And this is that Greek wisdom that comes into it. And so we have senseless reasoning that it appeals to the base of who we are as humans rather than to a higher base that says about who we are as humanity or who we could be in Christ. And when we deal with life through senseless reasoning, we become closed to wisdom, which leads to foolishness.
That's fine.
What's that?
Nothing. I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Like last week, we followed along in the book of Esther, but this wisdom of Solomon in the Apocrypha, there's no comparison to Proverbs or Ecclesiastes.
There's very much comparison. And for those in the Catholic Bible, they would include it in their wisdom books in the same way they would Ecclesiastes and Proverbs and etc. It is not considered to be missing parts of Proverbs, if that's what you're asking. Like Esther had parts that were taken out, be reinserted. This is its own book. So someone took Esther, rewrote it with those parts in it. This stands in the tradition of Proverbs, but not necessarily a replacement of it. It's kind of like, theoretically, Solomon wrote 2 books, but he didn't. But that's what they're trying to, sort of throw out there. But the perfection of knowledge comes through action, and action becomes a book in a lot of the Proverbs here that you do. There's a doing, and that knowledge is perfected through that action of living wisely. Thank you. So as we demonstrate wisdom through our actions and how we live our lives in the world, then we gain knowledge, which leads to more wisdom, and it's this sort of spiral that leads us up. But if we live in unrighteousness, we lack reason to understand things, which leads to foolishness, and another cycle there. So either way, there's a cycle depending on what way you're going. Either a cycle towards wisdom and righteousness, or a cycle towards foolishness and unrighteousness, I guess. So that's one, wisdom, the wisdom of humanity. The book also deals with wisdom as related to God, and the idea that wisdom is an entity, that God created wisdom. And so I was sort of toying around with this idea is, we talk about wisdom and we usually relate that to a type of decision we're making. Was it a wise decision? Did it portray, wisdom in us? Was it? And when we say that, we're often like, well, what does that mean? Well, there's a righteousness of that. It has justice in it. There's fairness in that. There's also some sense of rationality. We're making good decisions based on. Now, you might say that Solomon's famous discourse with the 2 women who said, "This is my baby, this is my baby," he's like, chop it in half. Which, now that's a little bit of play on. He was playing with them. He was messing with them. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was like, "I'm tired of these 2, just chop it in half." But it seems kind of trickery. Like if someone came to me for marital counseling, and I was like, "Let me trick you a little bit to show you a point." So So it's interesting that they use that as that ultimate symbol of wisdom. But I think the difference between just wisdom and pure rationality or pure logical decision making is that wisdom has a sense of love. And again, that love not just for the other, but a love for righteousness, where that love for other is sort of beget. So not that we hold these as opposites, wisdom versus righteousness, I'm sure. But enough so that they are different, but they also overlap in a similar format. Any questions? No, makes sense. The book as a whole is divided into, I said, 3 sections, and those 3 sections are roughly 1 to 5. That first book is often referred to as the book of, and this is where they thought originally that they were possibly written as 3 different authors. But there's enough language between them that make it tend toward a unified body, but there's also suspicion, as there would be for anything, that in these type of ancient manuscripts, even if they were written by 3, you could have a later editor that could have rewritten them. Because again, they weren't thinking, hey, these are like perfect words from God that I have to make sure that I get right, and if I don't, I'm going to be smote. They're just trying to communicate stuff about what's going, they're trying to, so many of these books boil down to Jewish identity. What does it mean to be a Jew? Well, they just need a constant reminder of it. But isn't that what Christian devotional writing is about? How many books have you read over the course of your life that were about Christian or theological topics that essentially are giving you ideals for how you express your life as a Christian in the world? Same sort of thing. We just have a plethora of it because we have publishing and writing and internet and all the technological means to distribute it. But if you go back to, 2,300 years, 2,200, 2,100 years from it, behind, when they didn't have all that. They didn't have printing presses. They didn't have, so that all these things still function in the same way, and that is to shape people. And really, that becomes actually a major point in why this book is both good and challenging at the same time. The second, and we'll come back to these are just sort of overarching themes. The second section, which is 6 through 9, and there are some verses attached to those, but I'm just giving you them roughly. So the first book deals with eschatology, and it's about the end time justice. It's about justice to the ruler of the nations. It's about and justice in the sense of punishment. So it has a very stark dichotomy between wicked and the just, and the wisdom of the just versus the ways of the wicked, and the wicked versus the wise. And we'll kind of look at those, and we'll see those. But that wise and that sort of wicked versus wise leads into the second chapter, where then all of a sudden you have this sort of kingly character of Solomon coming in and teaching you how to be wise. So in the second part of it, which again is 6 through 9, it's more proverbial, more written like the book of Proverbs. You have more of a focus on wisdom, challenges of wealth, the woes of power. And again, the same sort of themes that you'll see running through the book of Proverbs, just sort of reincarnated in a different context, and maybe reinterpreted if they're being rewritten, reinterpreted in the context of first century before Christ, which was, again, that battle between how do you take a Jew who has been in a diaspora from his own, or exiled from his own nation in Egypt, the land of once their slavery, with a strong Greek influence around that. We're wrestling with identity. What does it mean to be a Jew in that context? The last section, verses.
Jason?
Yeah.
Question. I noticed, just glancing through this, that they refer to wisdom in the female sense, she, her.
Absolutely.
What is the reasoning for that?
That was a regular personification. And I would say, I shouldn't say most, not all cultures. Many cultures gender their objects or their nouns, or their, that they put genders. I mean, Spanish is a perfect example that if you don't know your laws or no, French, like laws, lay, was it law,
Yeah.
and lay is masculine. Hebrew and Greek both have those as well. So Greek, and again, I don't claim to be a language scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but you also have a common practice just in terms of cultures as a whole of assigning, the tabernacle. I don't know if the body of the body of Christ is referred to as bride of Christ, she. There's a gender.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that too. Yeah.
I don't know if the temple is. I'm trying to think, is it ever referred to as a he or she? I think it was always been gender neutral, but we refer to cars as she's, and we refer to boats, and I don't know what I know there's a whole tradition of that. I remember actually at one point in my life reading something about that. I don't really remember the whole, but no, wisdom has always been personified in like Mother Earth, and I think, and my guess is maybe because there's a nurturing side of that. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, Lady Wisdom is the way wisdom is personified, but the same thing is true in Proverbs as well. Wisdom is portrayed as a feminine characteristic, or a feminine persona. The last book, which contains, or the last section, which 10 through 19, is the book of history. Usually and it lists and it demonstrates God's power in history, God's mercy, the woes of false worship, a term called recapitulation, which is the renewal of things. And it does contain a nice doxology, but the theme through all of that is Lady Wisdom has been journeying with Adam all the way through Joseph. And all of the unfaithfulness is the moment, and as we look at it, and if you haven't read it, it's all interesting, but the first part I think is just sort of run of the mill. The last part and the way it's take on it and some of the discrepancies are interesting. And so we'll spend a little more time in the last historical part, which is part of the reason also that it wasn't considered canonical by us, not only because it was written in Greek, but some of the discrepancies between that are just too widespread to say, hey, this is probably not written by Solomon. If it's being claimed to be written by Solomon, you would own it as a pseudepigraphal, or we have to reject it or put it in Apocrypha, which is what we ultimately did. But Lady Wisdom is looked at as sort of journeying with them through those stories. Let's look at some of the biblical connections and some of the differentiations and why that maybe some of the earlier church fathers thought that it could have been and actually a sort of canonical book. Does anyone, I have a Bible here. Look up with in that word, Carrie. Will you look up Wisdom 7? Just Wisdom chapter 7, and I'm going to look up First Kings here, just as by way of example. First Kings. So there have been comparisons in the text to. I'll give you the verses here. 1 second. First Kings 3, 6-9 says, and Solomon said, "You have shown great steadfast love of your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept him for this great steadfast love, and you have given him a son to sit on the throne today. And now the Lord my God, you shall make your servant king in place of my father David. Although I'm only a little child, I do not know how to go in or go out or come in. Your servant is in the midst of the people who you have chosen, a great people so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding, mind given to govern your people, ability to discern between good and evil, or who can govern this, your great people." And then if you would read just sort of Wisdom chapter 7, starting with verse 1. If you don't mind, I can read too, if you don't mind. You want to read?
Just the one verse?
No, you can just start reading it from the beginning. Go ahead and read down to the whole thing all the way through 14 is kind of a pursuit of, maybe just read to to 10.
I myself am also mortal, like everyone else, and am a descendant of one formed first and born of the earth. I was molded into flesh in the time of the 10 months in my mother's womb, being compacted in the blood from the seed of man and pleasure that came with sleep. I also, when I was born, drew in the common air and fell on the related earth, uttering like all for my first voice the same cry. I was nursed with care in swaddling clothes, for no king had any other first beginning. But all men have one entrance into life and a common departure. For this reason, I prayed, and understanding was given to me. I asked, and a spirit of wisdom came unto me. I prefer her before scepters and thrones. I considered riches nothing in comparison to her. Neither did I liken her any priceless gem, because all gold in her presence is a little sand, and silver will be considered as clay before her. I loved her more than health and beauty, and I chose to have her rather than light, because her bright shining is never laid to sleep.
So there you get in that sense of Solomon as a leader was pursuing wisdom. He, in the passage, and maybe I didn't read as far, but wisdom is better than riches and gold. Wisdom is better than priceless gems, and that sense of the things of this earth are, or have a vapor, but wisdom is something that is sustaining and lasting. Wisdom 9 verses. Thank you, Carrie. 9, 7, and 8 say, "You have chosen me to be your king and to judge over your sons and daughters. You've given me command to build a temple on your holy mountain, an altar in the city of your habitation, the copy of the holy tent that you prepared from the beginning." Well, that sounds a lot like what God told Solomon to do. God had Solomon build the temple. So now here, but this was written as Solomon's voice. So it's meant to kind of draw back to that, So there are these connective tissues that make it seem very Solomon-ish, but again, written in Greek. Now, and then in chapters 9 through 10, you have the rehearsal of the Old Testament events, but then you have this very interesting thing, and it both from 9 and starting from sort of the historical chapters, you have what it was called, what's one said, an intimate knowledge of the cultural understanding of Judaism. So in other words, like there was although it was written in a Greek language with that philosophy coming in, but it had an intimate knowledge of not only the history of Judaism, but the way it was being interpreted at the time. And so one of the things that I thought that was very interesting is there was a conflation of a number of narratives. And it was, and again, as I said earlier, you have similar language, similar aspects in terms of literary nature to Jubilee, to Philo, to the life of Moses, Second Enoch, and the ascension of Isaiah. So you have all of these common cultural influences, and some of the metaphors that they used that were sort of mistaken. I marked them in my Bible. I didn't write them on my notes. If you in verse chapter 10, it says, wisdom is also chapter 10, verse 5. You're looking, if you have it in front of you. Wisdom also, when the nations in wicked agreement had been put into confusion, recognized the righteous man and preserved him blameless before God and kept him strong in the face of his compassion for his child. So what are they doing? Who does that sound like? A blameless man who had compassion for his child? Abraham. Mm-hmm. And yet when the nations were wicked in agreement, had been put into confusion, what's that? The Tower of Babel. Was Abraham around the same time as the Tower of Babel? No. So you have in the historical accounts, but that same conflation appears in these other apocryphal books, demonstrating that at that time, they didn't have a very good understanding of their own chronology or their own history. Mm-hmm. And they actually squished together some things. So when they're taking these larger books and saying, these things don't line up, like when you have something that makes that claim that they were there at the same time, that becomes a problem for the other parts of the Bible that separates them. And you could say, oh, well, maybe he just was squishing them together, but it happens throughout. What is that one here? The same chapter, verses 15 through 17. A holy people, blameless race, wisdom delivered from a nation of oppressors. She entered the soul of the servant of the Lord and withstood the dread of kings and wonders and signs. She gave to the holy people a reward for their labor. She guided them along a marvelous way, became a shelter to them by day and a starry flame through the night. She brought them through the Red Sea and led them through deep waters. So clearly they're talking about the Exodus, right? Well, she says she gave to the holy people rewards for their labors. And this is a reference to the passage that they think that says, plunder the Egyptians before you take them off. And so now you have Lady Wisdom being credited with the plunder that they were meant to take off as a reward for their labor. And so just in terms of reward for labor, that has created problems for both rabbinic and Christian biblical scholars in terms of how to reconcile that with other passages in the Old Testament. The third, I marked another one. Let's see, where was it? Maybe I just thought I marked it. Oh, it is. 19, verse 6. For the whole creation in its nature was fashioned anew, complying with your commands so that your children might be kept unharmed. The cloud was seen overshadowing the camp, and the dry land emerged where water had stood before. And so you might be thinking he's talking about Noah at this point, right? That sounds a little Noah-ish. And then at 7b, an unhindered way out of the Red Sea, and a grassy plain out of the raging waves, where those protected by your hand passed through as one nation after gazing on the marvelous wonders, where they ranged like horses and leapt like lambs, praising you, and so on and so forth. But what you have there is almost the vision of, instead of the waters parting as in the waters on the side, you have the idea of this sort of like the way they got over that the earth rose to give them a path across. Well, that creates a lot of confusion. I mean, like, that doesn't make sense. So when you have something like that, that distorts the narrative that is considered canonical, it lends itself to say, hey, maybe this isn't something that really should be considered canon. Not that it's bad, not that there are things that contain it are wrong, but that in cases like that, those are metaphors that lend themselves to discrediting it as a reliable source, as if God is the author of our confusion as well. Okay, any questions thus far? We'll stop there in a second. No.
Oh, minor thing, I wondered when Carrie read, it seemed like a different translation. And you're reading,
Do you
I'm
use-
following New Revised Standard, and Carrie's was different.
Hey, I don't know what version it is. That's just, I bought the
Literal standard.
Oh, so literal, actually, that's not bad, because what it's giving us is, if I'm not mistaken, it's giving us what the literal stand, I without having looked at it, just by version, by there's an interlinear that actually, that puts them side by side. But the literal version means that they probably are taking the Greek words and placing them in some sort of word for word manner, so that you're not getting, because I mean the language that I had in my NRSV of it was much more fluid. I mean, like, but again, that represents a certain time and place, and they're probably trying to go for accurate, and that's the complete book, so they're giving it all. Anything else? Like I said, the first section and the second section, if they were actually two different sections, you can go to, if you have a version of it with you, you can go to chapter 1, and it starts out, love your neighbors, you rulers of the earth, think of the Lord in goodness and seek him with a sincerity of hearts. And then you jump up to 6:1, and it says, listen therefore, O kings, and understand, learn, O judges of the ends of the earth. So it's that sense of they're speaking to others that give people, and this is the major sort of division amongst biblical scholars, is whether there's 3 parts being 1, 6, and 10, or whether this 1 and 6 that both start with speaking to the rulers is sort of one section unto itself. Lastly, and then we can actually noodle through it a little bit if you'd like. The theological themes, as if you really haven't figured those out, that you love wisdom and you love righteousness, same as Proverbs, which is why many church fathers said it's good for instruction, it's good for teaching. Love wisdom and righteousness, nothing wrong with that. The wicked persona is characterized in particular in that first part of the book as someone who is seeking pleasure or hedonistic, who's just sort of life is almost. And then the interesting thing is, although it's considered a wisdom book, then you have Ecclesiastes. If you remember, that's like, just do whatever you want, embrace the day, enjoy the fruit of your labor, and so. But in this book would take that same sort of embrace the frivolousness of the day as hedonism. And that fools or the unwise or the wicked leave things to chance. They're sort of gambling on life. Unrighteous, again, as I said earlier, unrighteousness for the author of this book means senseless reasoning, which leads to being closed to wisdom, which leads to a sense of foolishness. As you mentioned earlier, Nora, the theme of Lady Wisdom is sort of is cast as, and actually, as I say that now, it makes more sense, and I probably should have said that earlier. This was not ever written for women. Like, let's just be clear about that. So Lady Wisdom, when you're trying to attract men to the idea of something, personifying it as a woman was not, and was probably a good rhetorical move. But Lady Wisdom was sort of poised as someone that you pursue after, you desire with all of your heart. Lady Wisdom is something that is also portrayed as something that God created. So again, that's still that idea of God created out of nothing, and that Lady Wisdom has been aiding throughout the story of Israel. And it takes the stance, lastly, of that wisdom is not inherent to us. That is not a trait that is natural to us, and that actually is more of a Hellenized view, that Greek view coming in, and it can't be taught. That you can't, in other words, you can't just instruct someone wisdom. You can say, this is what you should do. This is the wise thing. That doesn't necessarily, that's you obtaining the knowledge of what could be wise, But really the theme of it is that sense of action, that in the practice of action, that practice of doing something, that wisdom has grown. So this goes back to a basic philosophical understanding. Much of the New Testament or Greek thought either vacillates between two, I don't want to call them opposite, because I don't think they're really opposite, but they do sort of poise themselves as two sides. The Platonic side says that if we contemplate what is pure and holy, then that will influence our behavior and we will be therefore live holy lives. Or you could take that out of the Christian context. If we contemplate that which is good, it will lead to our good actions. In that basic premise that when we contemplate on that which is good, we'll go and do that, is the goodness of humanity. This is what undergirds most of the free will theism. The three ideas that we have free will, that we're not totally depraved, is if we just teach people how to behave well, they will. That's an optimistic view of humanity, right? We know that's not necessarily true. Even if we teach them. So wisdom in this book really focuses on behavior and action. When you participate in what, and so the difference is Plato said, when you contemplate on good, then you go do good, that's how you become good. Aristotle, his student, said actually, whether or not you know good or not, when you participate in good acts, that you are eventually shaped in that goodness. And that would have been also extended to the idea of wisdom. When you participate, when you act upon wisdom in your daily life, when you exercise that, not in book learning, but in practice, that is what gives you that knowledge of wisdom. And in the same way I said earlier, your wickedness leads to senseless reasoning, which means you're close to wisdom, and foolishness, and that foolishness then is in that cycle. Whereas when you focus on that which is good and do that which is good, that reinforces that good in you, and it's that cycle leading up. And so very much that sense of action, practice and action, and that Aristotelian influence appears in this book as a whole. So that's all I have in terms of content. I told you there wasn't as much. And just as a way of just, if you want to take a look, we can take just a minute or two. You don't have to open it up either. Just if you don't, one you see, and just if you look at it, and you sort of read just the first chapter, verse or two of each chapter. Love righteousness, you rulers of the earth, and it goes down. For perverse thoughts separate people from God. Like, again, this is, so now all of a sudden right there, it's all of a sudden the wicked, the unrighteous, those who dwell on those things, you're separated from God. When in his power is tested, it exposes the foolish, because wisdom will not enter the deceitful soul. That dichotomy between wisdom and foolishness. Chapter 2 primarily deals with the way the unholy or the ungodly or the unrighteous view life. But the ungodly by their words and deeds summon death. Consider him a friend. They pined away. They made a covenant with him because they are fit to belong to his company. For they reasoned unsoundly, saying to themselves, short and sorrow is our life. There is no remedy for life when it comes to the end, and no one has been known to return from Hades, for we are born by mere chance, and hereafter we shall be as though we had never been, for our breath in our nostrils is smoke. The reason, and does that sound like a little bit of Ecclesiastes? There's a little bit of that chance piece. There's a little bit of the unreasoned, unsound reason piece. Jump ahead, end of chapter 2, and mine has a label, error of the wickedness, and it's just thus they reasoned that they were led astray, for the wickedness binded them. It's just sort of an explanation of the wickedness and where they got where they are. Destiny of the righteous, but the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. Again, the righteous who dwell with God, they're protected by God. It's a constant re-emphasizing of this aspect. The ungodly will be punished as their reasoning deserves. Strong emphasis on that reason. That's that Greek influence. For blessed is the barren woman who is undefiled, who has not entered into a sinful union, for she will have fruit when God examines the soul. Blessed is also the eunuch. And it deals with this whole section of childlessness. If they die, it's probably something that they were dealing with in that community at the time. And they add those things to sort of relate it to the community that is there. And then chapter 4 continues on in that same rhetoric. Better than this is a childlessness with virtue. So even more than childless, even more than having a child, virtue wisdom reigns supreme. Verse 4:16, the triumph of the righteousness, and then you get the eschatological or the end times notion around chapter 5. They will come up with dread when their sins are reckoned, their lawless deeds will convict them of their face, and the righteous will stand with great confidence in the presence of those who oppress them. That final judgment day is held up. And again, later on in chapter 5, the reward of the righteous. And then you have that break in 16, and now you just get into basically 4 chapters that sound like could have literally been taken almost out of the book of Proverbs. But you can shove those in there, and most of those you're not going to see. I mean, there are some differences. It's worth reading and looking over. I'm immortal, and that's where, I'm immortal like everyone else. That sense of Solomon claiming who he is, and yet seeking out wisdom. Later in 7, the nature of wisdom. 8, Solomon's love for wisdom. I love for her and sought her from my youth, desired to take her for my bride. She became enamored by her beauty. Chapter 8, 9, therefore I determined to take her to live with me, knowing that she would, so there it's personification of her as a woman, almost in the sense of who she is. The section end of either the whole section or of the second section ends with 9 and a Solomon in his prayer for wisdom, which is a lovely sort of refrain. If you haven't read, it's a good book to read. I mean, I think it's actually, there's some there, and actually I would say that there are some things in here when I read it before I studied it, I didn't really realize, like when I was reading about, I didn't even pick up on some of the ground. I was just skimming. I wasn't reading for study. I was just sort of saying what was in there. But I think if you read it that way, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on the discrepancies unless you were actually thinking through, like, how is this problematic? 10 then goes on and it says the work of wisdom from Adam to Moses. And that again goes from Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then 400 years of slavery to Moses. And then it basically just talks about how wisdom was this ultimate player. She, is constantly she descended with them into the dungeon. She, when they were thirsty, they called upon her. For when they heard that through their own punishment, so it's verse after verse, it's the personification of wisdom as someone who has journeyed with Israel. And just the larger categories are the subtitles. Wisdom led the Israelites through the desert, punishment for the wicked. God is powerful and merciful. Sins of the Canaanites. God is sovereign. God's lessons for Israel, the punishment of the Egyptians, the foolishness of the nature worship. We do that around here, maybe. Foolishness of idolatry, folly of the navigator praying to an idol, origin of evils of idolatry, benefits of worshiping the true God, foolishness of the worshiping clay idols, serpents in the desert, disastrous storms strike Egypt, the Israelites receive manna, terror strikes the Egyptian by night, light shines on the Israelites, death of the Egyptian firstborn, the Red Sea, God guides and protects his people, punishment for Egyptians, new harmony in nature, and a conclusion. So you have this detailed, and I would have to say it's worth, if you're going to really look at it, I would say skim through 10. You're welcome to take that too if you want to have a version of it. But 10 through 19 is an interesting read, and it's a good little jump through the history of Israel. But because of that, the connection to that, and if you weren't scrutinizing, you can see how it connects to the other biblical stories. And so they wanted to include it because it seems like, and again, the Jews don't look at it as having to be perfect word of God. They look at it as, again, 3 things. The Torah is the words from God. The prophets were the words of God through prophets. So those become important, not as important as God's words in the Torah, and then the writings. And this would have been considered in the writings. These are the way God moved in the earth. So for Jews, although they don't consider it because it wasn't a part of the original document and it was written in Greek, and that's probably the major, let's get it out of here. But for the rest of the church, it contains some of the documents. So it contains some of the same themes and contains things that are worthwhile reading and understanding, as long as we keep in mind that is not meant to be God's direct word. And that's the wisdom of Solomon. Any thoughts, questions, things that come to mind?
Question.
Yeah.
Right here. So was Solomon wise?
No.
I mean, maybe for a pre-Holy Spirit Jew in the 1,000 years before Christ, sure. I mean, comparatively, yeah. Compared to now, maybe not, because but who knows? I mean, he's considered, I mean, but really, I don't think this has anything to do with Solomon.
Yeah.
That's a whole other.
It personifies, I mean, it speaks in his voice at times. And he claimed to be wise. He claimed to have received the gift of wisdom from God.
Yeah.
But there were a few passages, and I didn't mark them. I started reading through where it talks about spirit. And I didn't quite grasp that because I know you've always said the spirit wasn't given until the New Testament, but there were references to the spirit in this section.
I didn't see the exact verses to know what you're, but
Go back and look at it. I don't remember where that came up, but it just struck me because I didn't think there were that many references.
Yeah.
Being led by the Spirit in the Old Testament.
I mean, spirit is just viewed differently in the Old Testament. We view spirit with a very, robust sense of like God's spirit in us, but they didn't have that same sense of spirit. Was more episodic. Spirit came upon a prophet, came upon someone, as opposed to spirit dwelling within our own souls and beings.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you remember in Huck Finn, Mark Twain's novel, Jim the slave has a long kind of monologue about Solomon. And his whole premise was that Solomon wasn't really wise. And the story did not make sense to Jim. And he gave us examples that having a harem was probably very noisy.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a boarding house, he said. And there would have been a lot of blim blamming going on. That was one of his complaints about Solomon. But the big one was that whole, and we always just were taught this. Well, this was Solomon's wisdom. That judgment that he pronounced on those two women fighting over the child. Well, okay, we'll just cut the child in two. And Jim, the character Jim had some. I looked this up because I was thinking about, was Solomon wise? That's what we always assume. And he says something like, he says, he holds up a dollar bill to Huck, and he says, weren't that the beatenest notion in the world? You just take a look at it a minute. And he points to, there's one woman, there's the other woman. And here's this dollar bill is the child. And he says, both of them claim it. So what does I do? Does I shit around amongst the neighbors and find out which one it belongs to and hand it over? The right one, all safe and sound, the way that somebody that had any gumption would do? No, I take and whack that bill in two and I give half to you and half to the other. That's the way Solomon was going to do with the child. Now I want to ask you, what's the use of half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what's the use of a half a child? I wouldn't give a darn for a million of them.
Yeah.
There's a certain, that makes more sense to me than what Solomon did.
Well, I don't think Solomon really meant for them to do it.
Yeah, I don't either.
I think it was
Would a judge do that? Al, would you have made a judgment like that?
Heaven, no.
No, but I think it's very easy to look back at a again, they didn't have the spirit dwelling in the same way we do. In the same, rationality has increased in 2000 or even, I guess, in 3,000 years from when Solomon would have been on the scene. So maybe when we look at Solomon's wisdom compared to the wisdom that has surfaced since the time of Solomon, we would say that doesn't seem very wise. But maybe in the sense of where they were at in the biblical narrative, when you look prior to Solomon, you got David screwing up, you got, how many, you keep going back, there was no wisdom, there wasn't much wisdom there. So maybe, maybe it is, and I'm just throwing it off the top of my head. I agree, it's a weird expression of wisdom, save for the fact that I would say he was more cunning in figuring out who was the actual mother as opposed to, again, God, the story of the Bible is God using broken people who think they're probably smarter than they are. And so maybe Solomon's wisdom was not quite as, as good as we think. So,
Well, didn't in what I don't know if it was in Kings, First Kings, or one of the other books of the Bible, doesn't it say somewhere that God made him the wisest? Isn't there some reference to that? But context of it, the beginning and end of Solomon's life, and what you said, Jason, I think I don't believe Solomon meant to cut the baby in half. He was bringing out the values of the true mother, or who would say this or that. It solved the problem, but it's not a literal thing. Sometimes wisdom is not black and white. It's something that gets to the final result.
and I would say even the example that Jim might have used in the terms of like a dollar bill, I mean, that's just a gross reduction of the value of human life to maybe $1 million bill would be more comparable with a sense of loss, because who cares about a dollar bill at any? I mean, compared to the life of someone, even on $1 million.
Yeah, Jim would have cared about a dollar bill, not Jim.
Yes.
A dollar bill back then was probably closer to $50 today.
Okay. Well, still, 50 is not. I don't really care.
I know.
But I think if it was my 50 and the judge here was like, okay, I'm going to tear it in half, I'm not going to be like, hey, give to you. I don't want to see the 50 ruined. Give Carrie the 50. I value the 50. The value is in the love of a mother for her child versus the monetary, So I think that there's part of me intellectually that would reject that example in Huck Finn just because, or in Mark Twain, because of the value of the dollar versus the value of the baby. So, anything final comments? No?
I was just in a light comparison looking at Proverbs and the constant comparison to righteousness and wisdom. And I wondered I got to the end and I wondered what the words of Agur in Proverbs 30 or Lamel in 31 meant. The words, this happens to be in this Bible translation I'm using, but what was the purpose? I mean, it was written by a Hellenistic Jew, allegedly, the wisdom of Solomon's in the Apocrypha. But what was the purpose of it? As you mentioned, it was to let everybody didn't know their history, so they're finding another way to write it and represent it. Is that the purpose of it? Yeah.
Maybe it was a popular novel back then. They're like, hey, new release from King Solomon. I think it was, again, people weren't readers, so it was something to be read within. And when you have a Jewish community in Egypt and in diaspora who are not connected and they haven't heard from God, and you're trying to shape their identity, that happens through these sort of literature distributions. So,
and my section is in, and maybe you know more, the Renover, the Spiritual Formation Bible. It's by Richard Foster and Dallas Willard, Eugene Peterson, Walter Bregeman. I wondered what, in placing the Apocrypha in spiritual formation, or the Renover, are you familiar with that, Jason, or what? It's more of a deep study thing, or?
no, the Renoir, yeah.
I know I've never really gotten into it, but it has sections in the other books of the Bible that you go off in different directions of prayer and so forth. But it's interesting to see what these people put together and why they didn't get incorporated in the final canon.
Well, I think there's some Catholic connections too, if I'm not mistaken, in Renoir. So, all right. Well, it's 1:15. We're I don't know if we're really overtime or under time, or I don't know when we ever end. We always.
I think we're under. I have 6.
We're under from normal, but we're over theoretically.
So you're not meeting next week, right? And
Or
then
the following.
What's next week?
the next 2 weeks?
Week before Christmas. Is that 14?
We can. I
Next
mean, if you guys,
Wednesday is
I'm happy to meet.
21st.
Yes,
You will be
yes.
here. Don? We're gonna be
Yeah,
here.
company
I mean,
going.
I'm happy to meet.
We'd
We
probably.
won't be here.
All right.
On his way to pick up someone at the airport and,
Well, we'll look at Syriac next week, which is a longer book, unless you guys want to take another. I mean, I was gonna take the week between East, the week after Christmas, I was gonna skip. But
We can be available next week.
you're not, are you guys, well, why don't I send out an email, all the usuals, and we'll see where we're at.
Okay.
But
How
you
do you
guys will be
spell- Which is the book you want to do next? How do you,
Syriac,
Tirac? How do you spell that?
Sirack, I think, or ACH maybe,
CH.
ACH.
Sounds like a Klingon name.